we are going to review the different types of formed elements that are found in the bloodstream. Now, formed elements is what we commonly call our cells. There's three types of blood cells. You have red blood cells, which are known as erythrocytes, white blood cells called leukocytes, and then the platelets, which are called thrombocytes. Now here in this photo, we are looking at a picture of blood as we would see it under the microscope. And one thing you need to be able to do is to distinguish the different types of formed elements. Now what you see most commonly here are going to be the erythrocytes, or the red blood cells. Those are the numerous red or pinkish color small cells that you see scattered throughout. So I'm just going to draw a line to a couple of these here. We'll say maybe this one and this one, and then I'll do one up here at the top, and hopefully that'll help you kind of understand that all of these that are the smaller red circles, these are going to be your erythrocytes. Now, the job of erythrocytes is to carry oxygen. They have a protein inside of them called hemoglobin, and that hemoglobin picks up the oxygen from the lungs and carries it within the red blood cells out to all the cells and tissues of our body. The next one we're going to label are the platelets. Now, platelets are actually fragments of cells. They're derived from a large cell known as a megakaryocyte, and that megakaryocyte will fragment into little pieces, and those little pieces enter the bloodstream as platelets. The platelets are these smaller little purple cells that we see right here. I'm going to put an arrow to one. You just see that little purple speck. That little purple speck is what we would call a platelet, okay? Now we get to the white blood cells. Now the white blood cells are the leukocytes. There's actually 5 different types of leukocytes, and a way I remember them is by population. Usually I go by most populated to least populated in the bloodstream. And the saying that I remember, or that I use to help me remember, is never let monkeys eat bananas, okay? Never let monkeys eat bananas. The never, the N, stands for neutrophil. Let is lymphocytes. Monkeys, monocyte. Eat, eosinophil. Banana, the basophil. Now this is the population of red blood cells from the most or the population of white blood cells from the most populated to the least. So that means neutrophils for never comes first. That's what you have the most of. And basophils come at the end. That's what you have the fewest number of, okay? Now we're going to identify these white blood cells. Now, in reality, white blood cells are white. They're clear, translucent. So we can't really see them very well under a microscope. Anytime we look at blood under the microscope, these white blood cells have been stained. So we typically will see them as purple or pink or a reddish color. That's because of the stain that was used in preparing the slide. So we're going to start first with the neutrophil, that never. Neutrophils, the key characteristic to remember with neutrophils is that they have a multi-lobed nucleus, and usually it's 3 to 5 lobes. And an interesting fact is the older a neutrophil is, the more lobes the nucleus will have. So if we have a neutrophil with 3 lobes, that's fairly young. You can have a neutrophil with 5 lobes, 6 lobes, and that's a pretty old neutrophil that's circulating in our bloodstream. So this cell right here, I'm going to drag my label. This guy right here is our neutrophil. And if you look, that is a good solid 3 lobes. I'm going to just kind of draw to point out these lobes. Here's a lobe. I'm going to put a number 1 right here. Here's a lobe, put a 2 there. And then here's a lobe right here. So 3 lobes of nuclei are in that cell, and that tells me it's a neutrophil. Now, neutrophils are the most abundant of all the white blood cells you have. They're the first to arrive at the site of an infection. So if you fall down and skin your knee, neutrophils are the first one there. You get a paper cut, neutrophils are there. Okay, they also tend to be in large numbers at acute infections, and acute infection means localized. So maybe you got your ear pierced and it's infected. You'd have a lot of neutrophils there. Or if you have an ingrown toenail or fingernail, neutrophils would be there. So any area that's a localized spot of infection, you typically will see a large amount of neutrophils there. Now our next cell we're going to name are the lymphocytes. So never let neutrophil first. L is the lymphocytes. Lymphocytes have a nice round nucleus. So I'm going to drag this label right here under this guy right there. Lymphocytes have a huge nucleus, and in fact, most of the time with the lymphocytes, you barely even see the cytoplasm. There's just a little hint, typically along the edges of the lymphocyte. In this particular picture, you've got some pretty big edges around the side, but a lot of times you can barely even see the edge of the cytoplasm because the nucleus is so large. Lymphocytes play a role in what we call the specific immune system. There's two types of lymphocytes, B cells and T cells. B cells secrete antibodies and T cells attack directly. Typically, if you have a bacterial or viral infection, those lymphocytes are what's going to be fighting that battle for your body. Now, the next one we're going to name are the monocytes. Monocytes are actually the largest of all the white blood cells, and they can be identified by their U-shaped nucleus. The nucleus of a monocyte typically will have a dip in it. Now this one has a really big dip. You can see that almost looks like the letter U that's there. And in fact, this cell at the very bottom left, that's also a monocyte. Now it's difficult to tell. You can tell these two are quite different, but there is a dip right here. I'm going to draw an arrow. See that little dip right there? That tells us it's a monocyte. Monocytes have this little dip or indentation within the nucleus. A U-shaped nucleus is usually how we define it. So that cell in the upper left and even that guy down there at the bottom, those are collectively monocytes. Now, monocytes are special. They're actually one of my favorite white blood cells. They have the ability to leave the cell or leave the blood vessel and migrate into the tissue space. And when they do that, they change, they differentiate, they begin to specialize, and they become what we call macrophages. Macrophages are big eaters. They have the ability to engulf large amounts of debris. So these monocytes function as macrophages when they're out in the tissue space. When they're circulating in the blood, we call them monocytes. But out in the tissues, they flatten out and get really big. That's when we call them macrophages. You also tend to see a lot of monocytes during chronic infections. So if there is an infection that's ongoing, something like bronchitis or maybe inflammation of the GI tract, digestive tract, or somewhere else in your body that's constantly inflamed or just a continuous battle, typically you'll see a lot of monocytes in these chronic infections. Now the next one we're going to name are called eosinophils. The eosinophil is this guy right up here at the very top. He has very distinctive granules within the cytoplasm. You can see in this picture all these little tiny red dots. And actually that's another distinguishing feature. Typically eosinophils will stain more of a reddish color as opposed to purple. If you look at all these other white blood cells that are here, they're all stained more of a purple color. Well, that eosinophil has a purple nucleus, but if you look at the granules, they're more red or pinkish in color. Sometimes they may even look orangey in color. So that's a distinguishing factor of picking out an eosinophil. If it's got red or kind of this pinky orange color granules, that's got to be an eosinophil. Another distinguishing characteristic is the nucleus. Eosinophils have two-lobed nuclei. So only two lobes. To me, they almost look like a pair of lungs that's in there. So you see these two lobes there within that eosinophil. Our last one we're going to name are the basophils. The basophil is this guy right down here at the very bottom. Now, basophils have a ton of dark staining granules. You see, you can barely even make out the nucleus actually in this particular picture because there's so many dark staining granules. Basophils typically are more common in allergic reactions. So are eosinophils. Both of these tend to appear more in allergies. Basophils secrete histamine, which contributes to the inflammatory response. And the eosinophils I mentioned earlier, they tend to increase in number during parasite infections. So be able to identify all of these different types of blood cells.